we're going to dive into some of the non-energy code options. First of all, of course, thank you, Kellen, and the rest of BayREN for inviting me here today to talk to you about something that I find really fun. So we'll try not to nerd out too much. But before I jump in, just in case you haven't heard of the Building Decarbonization Coalition yet, I wanted to let you know what that representation means. As the name implies, it is a coalition, but it is also a membership-based agency, nonprofit that includes local governments as well as manufacturers, utilities, and design community, as well as many others as our membership. So we try to really bring multiple perspectives to the conversation. Today, though, I get to talk about specifically some of the legal options that many of you have already heard about, but then perhaps a few more as we get into not just what's happening in the new construction space around electrification specific REACH codes, but then also expanding into existing building, as that seems to be increasingly a popular topic. So I'll be talking a lot about REACH codes, and I use that term to be an umbrella, and I use that term to really focus on building electrification specifically, because that's what decarb is, at least at this moment in time, for our purposes today. So just to start off, back in early 2019, several of us got together and did a legal analysis for what possible opportunities there were for local governments to legally be able to impact new construction, specifically around meeting climate action goals and other things. And that legal memo has been expanded to include existing buildings as well. And so I'll just walk through these very briefly. We've talked about REACH codes so far already. Often, as I mentioned, that has included the prohibition of or moratorium on gas infrastructure. It also includes a couple of other categories. So if we've seen an increasing conversation that I'll cover more in depth in just a moment around whether or not the appliances themselves can be regulated under their specific emissions, as well as conversations emerging around starting to require appliance replacement at different lever points, both upon burnout or potentially upon retrofit, and even at time of sale, different conversations that are occurring right now in cities near you, if you're not with one of those cities at this moment. We also are seeing increasing conversation around the potential to phase out the infrastructure at a community scale. So this is often called system-wide pruning, and there's an open proceeding at the Public Utilities Commission around the gas transition. But this is also happening at the local government level to ascertain whether or not there are neighborhoods or even whole communities that can start to phase out the system, turning off sections of the gas infrastructure specifically. We don't see a lot of this yet, but there is the potential to add a greenhouse gas mitigation or offset fee. This was really popular in the beginning of the 2019 conversations around REACH codes, where we're looking at levers to incentivize rather than just going all electric as a requirement. And then one of the questions earlier in the presentation, there was a conversation, what can you do if you can't do a REACH code? And project scale, CEQA mitigation at a planning office is one of those opportunities. And certainly can be, that's a lever that anyone can do at a planning level. And then lastly on this particular list is the building emission standards, also called building performance standards, which is typically used just on commercial projects to slowly over the course of time ramp down an emissions standard. So that's a long-winded way of saying there are lots of options. We're going to get into some specifics now. One thing in particular, new construction is really just about these top two. That's what we've seen so far in California, and it's working for the local government. Local governments, many of you on the phone, are using these two mechanisms, the energy-based code as well as the either health and safety or other municipal ordinance to prohibit the infrastructure itself. All right, so let's talk about some new construction examples. As has been summarized by others already, there's kind of three leading examples, and I just go over this briefly so that I can clarify the color coding on the next couple of charts. So we have the natural gas moratoriums, which is often called the Berkeley approach, the all-electric ordinances, which is very common in the Bay Area at large. And that could be all or some of appliances. And then electric preferred, which is actually it's becoming more rare. And that's the Marin County, elements of Marin County are doing this, as have many other jurisdictions. But we've seen over the course of time, some of those jurisdictions come back and make their new construction ordinances more aggressive. So this particular chart shows the pattern of adoption for those three approaches over the course of time. And my apologies, it's a little bit out of date, but what I want to draw your attention to is that so far this year, as far as I know, we have not had an electric preferred ordinance adopted for new construction. We're really trending more and more towards the natural gas infrastructure moratoriums and the all electric breach codes. We are starting to see electric preferred for existing buildings start to crop up. And again, I'll talk about that more in just a moment. How that breaks down over the 52 jurisdictions that have adopted so far in the state of California under the current energy code, or this code cycle, depending on how you want to look at it, is as follows. You can see electric preferred still is present, but a fairly small share of the pie. The gas moratoriums have been growing over this time, but by and large, most everyone has gone for the all electric approach, which is an energy code specific approach, as Misty and Will were discussing earlier. So happy to answer more questions about that, but I want to spend some time talking about existing buildings because this starts to build in that same vein. The mechanisms are largely not in the energy code approach, but more aligned with the gas moratorium and how you might go about this. That's not the only way, but there are a few approaches. So before I dive into that though, I just want to start recognizing that existing buildings are hard. They're much more complex. There's just such a diversity in what exists today. And there's also a diversity in terms of the impact that it could have to require certain upgrades at a specific time on specifically folks who might not be able to afford whatever that change is if there's not already existing infrastructure. So thoughtfulness is happening in a number of ways through a number of jurisdictions and other efforts that are happening right now about how to incentivize and encourage, but also really allow for an equitable electrification. But I just want to recognize that this is not as easy as new construction. There's also the rate structure to consider and just what that looks like for a number of different building types. And in addition to that, just continue to raise the concerns around eviction protections and any potential pass-through costs for rental properties. All right, with that said, I'm going to go back to this chart for a minute because what we're seeing emerge is all this exciting stuff on the bottom half of this chart. The two red arrows are focusing on what things are bubbling up right now in local governments. There are active conversations around requiring a replace on burnout ordinance that is happening now. There was a meeting this week, for example. There was also a kickoff meeting for starting the discussion about which approach out of the city of Oakland yesterday, if my brain remembers correctly. So there's definitely a lot of movement around existing building conversations. Part of that is this emission limits on appliances. And I'm going to come back to that because this is something that is likely going to happen at a regional or statewide scale and not at the local government scale. So I'll circle back on the current update there. We're also seeing, though, as I mentioned, this kind of bubbling up of longer term strategies, which really speak to the potential of setting 20-year targets and then working backwards from them around phase outs and building emission standards. And I would expect that we'll continue to see more of that particular trend. But more pressing are these red arrows again, and we'll dive into some of that. So specifically emissions limits on appliances. This is exciting for anybody not following this conversation. It's quickly evolving. So the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, unwieldy acronym here, BACMUD, does have current conversations. There's actually an open comment period now on their Regulation 9 Rules 4 and 6. That conversation is going to get pushed out into next year, but their proposal that has been released thus far shows these 3 different trigger levels, which starts to regulate nitrogen oxide emissions. So under their air quality authority, under the Clean Air Act, they're actually looking not at greenhouse gas emissions, they're looking at this other criteria pollutant for air quality. So it's a different mechanism. And so frankly, not something that some of us energy folks understand very well, but they're looking at increasing portion of our smog and other air quality factors that are coming now from buildings as we continue to clean up the transportation sector and the electricity sector, et cetera. So buildings and the appliances in them are increasingly on their radar. So when we get to the low NOx standard is something that can be met with high efficiency gas appliances, but a 0 NOx standard is not. So that is kind of the breaking point here. That the summary is that if this regulation, which is not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination, but if it were to pass as drafted, the 0 NOx water heaters would effectively mean that you couldn't buy a gas water heater in the greater Bay Area by 2027. So that simple thing, or not so simple thing, would absolutely start to change the landscape of existing buildings and the conversation around what local governments can and should do to facilitate that. And then similarly for the heating and ventilation systems to furnaces and so forth by 2029. Now, all of that is just regionally in the Bay Area. Layered on top of that is the Air Resources Board, which has an active scoping proceeding. Their plan under the AB 32 greenhouse gas emissions state goals are also underway, and they've released some scenarios that show carbon neutrality sometime in the next 20 to 25 years. Which would include appliance sales statewide as well. So we're definitely seeing movement from an air quality perspective on whether or not at least water heaters and furnaces would start to be phased out in their sale across the state. And the dates are here. Anybody who's interested in this, I encourage to get involved in either of these processes because there are active conversations happening of what should we regulate and how soon should we regulate these appliances. So that's it for the purposes of the presentation. I look forward to any questions. Thanks so much for your time.